On November 26th, 2018, the internet stopped making jokes, just for a moment, just long enough to feel something real. Steven Hillenburg, the marine biologist turned animator who created SpongeBob SquarePants, had died at the age of 57 from ALS. And the reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen for a showrunner. For a behind-the-scenes person, most casual viewers had never heard of. People weren't just mourning a show. They were mourning the person who gave them a specific feeling they didn't know how to name. A feeling of safety. A feeling of warmth at midnight. A feeling of laughing until your stomach hurts at a cartoon about a sea sponge. And then, in the very same episode, feeling something so tender it catches you completely off guard. And I remember exactly what I was doing when I found out. I was scrolling through Twitter, and suddenly every single post was SpongeBob. Not memes, not jokes, just grief. People sharing their favorite moments, their favorite episodes, the scenes that got them through rough nights, the scenes they'd watched 100 times without ever getting tired of them. And threaded through all of that grief was this other feeling, something harder to put into words. It wasn't just sadness that Hillenburg was gone, it was anger. Because by the time Steven Hillenburg died, the show he created had already been taken from him years earlier. Not literally, not legally, but creatively, spiritually, in every way that actually mattered. And the show that continued to air under his name bore so little resemblance to what he'd built that it felt like a betrayal long before it became a memorial. Tonight, we're going to talk about the downfall of SpongeBob SquarePants. All of it. Not the quick version, not the summary you've heard 100 times about how it went bad after the movie. The full story. The long, slow, complicated, infuriating, occasionally heartbreaking story of how the greatest animated comedy ever made was systematically dismantled by the very network that profited from it. We're going to talk about what the show was, what it became, why it happened, who's responsible, and whether there's any coming back from it. We're going to trace two threads through this whole thing, and I want you to hold them both in your head as we go. Thread 1 is the creative soul of SpongeBob, what Steven Hillenburg built, and what made it irreplaceable. Thread 2 is the machine, Nickelodeon's corporate apparatus that saw a golden goose and decided the best strategy was to squeeze it until there was nothing left. Those two threads run parallel for the first 3 seasons. And then, sometime around 2004, they diverge. And the story of SpongeBob's downfall is really the story of what happens when the machine wins. So get comfortable. We're going to be here for a while. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd really appreciate it. It helps us keep making these. And I genuinely think this one's going to be worth your time. Let's start at the beginning. In 1984, a kid from Lawton, Oklahoma, named Steven Hillenburg, graduated from Humboldt State University with a degree in natural resource planning and interpretation, with an emphasis on marine resources. That's a mouthful, but what it means is this. The guy who would eventually create the most successful cartoon in Nickelodeon history started his career not as an artist, not as a writer, not as an animator, but as a marine biologist. He took a job at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point, California, which is now called the Ocean Institute. And for 3 years, he taught kids about tide pool ecology, nautical history, and marine adaptation. He loved it. He loved watching kids get excited about starfish and sea cucumbers, and the weird little creatures that live in the spaces between rocks at low tide. And while he was there, he created something called the Intertidal Zone, a hand-drawn educational comic about tide pool animals. It was funny, it was scientifically accurate, and it contained the earliest seeds of what would become SpongeBob SquarePants. Here's the thing about Hillenburg that I think gets lost in the conversation about the show's decline, and it's the thing I keep coming back to every time I revisit the early episodes. He wasn't a comedy guy who learned about the ocean. He was an ocean guy who learned comedy. That distinction matters so much, because the world of Bikini Bottom, the world he eventually built, isn't just a random setting for cartoon chaos. It's a place that reflects a genuine understanding of and love for marine life. The characters aren't just funny animals in an underwater city. They're rooted in real biology, filtered through an animator's sensibility. SpongeBob is a sea sponge, not a kitchen sponge, which Hillenburg was very specific about. Mr. Krabs is a crab because crabs are associated with being cheap. but also because Hillenburg loved the way crabs move and interact. Sandy Cheeks exists because Hillenburg wanted to explore what it would look like for a land mammal to adapt to life underwater, which is the exact kind of question a marine biologist would ask. And in 1987, Hillenburg left the Ocean Institute to pursue animation. He enrolled at CalArts in 1989 in the experimental animation program, where he studied under Jules Engel, the founding director of the program, whom Hillenburg later called his art dad. Engel had actually been impressed by the intertidal zone when Hillenburg applied, which tells you something about the quality of that little hand-drawn comic. At CalArts, Hillenburg made a short film called Wormholes that won multiple festival awards, and after graduating, he got a job on Rocko's Modern Life as a writer, and eventually the creative director of the show's 4th season. And it was on Rocko's Modern Life that he met two people who would become central to SpongeBob. The first was Tom Kenny, a voice actor who would go on to voice SpongeBob himself. The second was the show's creator, Joe Murray, whose absurdist, detail-rich approach to animated comedy clearly influenced what Hillenburg would build next. I'm spending this much time on Hillenburg's background because I need you to understand something fundamental before we get into the decline. SpongeBob SquarePants wasn't a show that got lucky. It wasn't a show that stumbled into greatness through some combination of talented voice actors and good timing, although both of those things absolutely helped. It was a show that was meticulously designed by a person with a specific vision, a specific philosophy, and a specific set of skills that nobody else on the planet had in that exact combination. Marine biology, experimental animation, absurdist comedy, a deep love for the ocean, a genuine warmth toward children, an eye for visual detail that borders on obsessive. When you take all of that away, when you remove the person who held all of those threads together, what you get isn't SpongeBob with a few rough edges. What you get is a fundamentally different show wearing the same clothes. But we'll get to that. SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on Nickelodeon with a sneak peek on May 1st, 1999, right after the Kids' Choice Awards. The episodes that aired that night were Help Wanted, Reef Blower, and Tea at the Tree Dome. The series officially premiered on July 17th of that year, and from the very first episode, something was different. Help Wanted, Season 1, Episode 1, A, is 11 minutes of pure intention. SpongeBob wakes up, gets ready for his first day, applying at the Krusty Krab, and the episode follows him through a series of escalating absurd obstacles. It's funny, it's kinetic, it's visually inventive, and underneath all the slapstick, there's this genuine emotional engine driving the whole thing. SpongeBob wants this job. He wants it so badly that his enthusiasm is both the joke and the heart of the episode simultaneously. You're laughing at how over the top he is, and you're also rooting for him, because his joy is so pure and unguarded that you can't help it. And right there, in those first 11 minutes, Hillenburg established the thing that would make the show work for 3 seasons, and then get lost in everything that came after. SpongeBob's optimism isn't naive. It's not stupidity. It's not the obliviousness of a character who doesn't understand the world around him. It's a choice. SpongeBob sees the world clearly. He knows Squidward doesn't like him. He knows the Krusty Krab is a questionable establishment. He knows Mr. Krabs cares more about money than about his employees. And he chooses to find joy anyway. That's the engine. That's the whole engine. That's what makes him funny. And that's what makes him moving. And that's what makes him one of the most perfectly designed animated characters in the history of television. And the moment you lose that, the moment SpongeBob's optimism stops being a choice and starts being a symptom of cognitive impairment, the character stops working. The whole show stops working. And that's exactly what happened. But before we get to what went wrong, I want to sit with what went right for a minute, because the golden age of SpongeBob deserves to be talked about on its own terms, not just as a setup for the decline. Seasons 1 through 3 of SpongeBob SquarePants aired between 1999 and 2004, and they represent, I genuinely believe, one of the greatest sustained creative achievements in the history of animated television. I know that's a big claim. I mean it. These 3 seasons contain somewhere around 120 11-minute episodes, and the hit rate is staggering. Pizza Delivery, Dying for Pie, Band Geeks, Graveyard Shift, Chocolate with Nuts, Nasty Patty, SB129, Squid's Day, Off. The list goes on and on and on. And what makes it remarkable isn't just that the individual episodes are good, It's that the whole body of work maintains a level of consistency that seems almost impossible for an animated comedy. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Pizza Delivery, Season 1, Episode 5, A, aired on August 14th, 1999. It's a simple premise. SpongeBob and Squidward have to deliver a pizza. That's it. And it's 11 minutes of two characters walking through the desert, arguing, getting lost, riding a boulder, and ultimately delivering a pizza to a customer who rejects it because they didn't bring a drink. And when that customer yells at SpongeBob, SpongeBob breaks down crying, and Squidward, who has spent the entire episode being annoyed and frustrated and dismissive, takes the pizza and slams it in the customer's face. And that moment, that tiny moment, tells you everything you need to know about the show. Squidward doesn't like SpongeBob. He's irritated by him constantly, but he will not stand by and watch someone hurt him. There's a relationship there that's real, that's complicated, that's human in a way that transcends the fact that we're watching a squid and a sponge walk through a cartoon desert. Hillenburg understood that the comedy has to come from characters you care about, and that the emotional moments have to be earned by everything that surrounds them. I've rewatched Pizza Delivery probably 8 times putting this video together, and the thing that hits me hardest on rewatch is how confident the pacing is. They let scenes breathe. There's a long stretch where SpongeBob and Squidward are just walking, and it's funny because the silence is funny, because the framing is funny, because Squidward's exasperation is a living, breathing thing. Modern SpongeBob would fill that silence with a gross-out gag or a screaming reaction. The original show trusted its audience enough to let a moment sit. Or take Band Geeks, Season 2, Episode 15B, which aired on September 7th, 2001, and is widely considered the single greatest SpongeBob episode ever made. Squidward's rival, Squilliam Fancyson, challenges him to put together a marching band to perform at the Bubble Bowl. Squidward, who has never successfully led anything in his life, accepts the challenge and spends the episode desperately trying to teach the residents of Bikini Bottom how to play instruments. It goes terribly. They fight, they argue, instruments get lodged in skulls. And then, in the final 2 minutes, everything comes together. The band performs. And they don't just play adequately. They perform a full rock anthem, Sweet Victory, with SpongeBob on vocals, and the entire town rocking out in front of a packed stadium. And Squidward stands there on stage, tears in his eyes, and for the first and maybe only time in the entire series, he gets to win. No punchline, no reversal, no last-second humiliation. He wins. And the show lets him have it. I need you to think about why that moment works as well as it does. It works because for 60 episodes before Band Geeks, the show has been carefully, methodically, patiently establishing who Squidward is. He's bitter. He's pretentious. He's chronically disappointed. He plays the clarinet badly and paints self-portraits that nobody appreciates. He lives between a guy who never stops laughing and a guy who lives under a rock. And every episode has been slowly building this portrait of a person who wants so desperately to be recognized, to be seen as the artist he believes himself to be, and who is thwarted at every turn by his own limitations and his own inability to connect with the people around him. So when he finally gets his moment in Band Geeks, it doesn't feel random. It feels like a culmination. It feels like the show is saying, "We see you, Squidward. We know what you've been going through. Here's your moment." The Golden Age SpongeBob understood something that the later seasons completely lost sight of. You can only go as dark or as absurd as your characters allow. Squidward's misery is funny because we understand it. SpongeBob's optimism is funny because it's earned. Patrick's stupidity is funny because it exists alongside genuine warmth and loyalty. Mr. Krabs' greed is funny because it's tempered by occasional moments of real affection for his daughter Pearl, and even, reluctantly, for SpongeBob. Every character in seasons 1 through 3 exists in a state of productive tension between their worst impulse and their best self. And that tension is where all the comedy and all the emotion comes from. And I want to talk about something that I don't think gets enough attention in conversations about the Golden Age, which is the visual storytelling. Because SpongeBob in its prime was one of the most visually inventive shows on television, animated or otherwise. The background paintings were dense and detailed and full of sight gags that rewarded repeated viewing. The character animation was fluid and expressive in ways that went far beyond what Nickelodeon was doing with any of its other shows. And there's this specific thing that the early SpongeBob did with visual composition that I've never seen any other cartoon replicate, which is using the frame itself as a joke. The way a shot is composed, the way the camera lingers on something just a beat too long, the way a background character's expression tells a completely different story from what's happening in the foreground. That's not standard cartoon humor. That's filmmaking. That's the kind of thing you learn in an experimental animation program at CalArts. And it's one of the reasons the show felt so different from everything else on the air. And while we're talking about this, let me bring up a few more Golden Age episodes that demonstrate just how much range this show had, because I think the range is what gets undersold the most. Sailor Mouth, Season 2, Episode 18A, aired September 21st, 2001. SpongeBob and Patrick discover a word written on the dumpster behind the Krusty Krab and start using it without understanding that it's a curse word. The entire episode is built around the show's decision to bleep the profanity with dolphin noises and other sea creature sounds, which is both hilarious and genuinely clever. Because think about what the writers are doing here. They're making an episode about profanity for a children's show. An episode where every kid in the audience knows exactly what's being said, even though nobody says it. The humor works on two levels simultaneously. Kids laugh because funny sounds replace bad words, and adults laugh because the situation perfectly captures the experience of a kid discovering swearing for the first time. That's multi-generational comedy. That's writing that respects every viewer regardless of age. And the episode ends with Mr. Krabs falling and letting out a stream of bleeped profanity himself, which is the exact right payoff because it reveals the hypocrisy of the adult world in a way that kids understand intuitively, even if they can't articulate it. Golden Age SpongeBob did this constantly. It told two stories at the same time, one for children and one for everyone else, and both stories were complete on their own terms. Or take SB129, Season 1, Episode 14A, aired December 31st, 1999. Squidward accidentally freezes himself and wakes up 2,000 years in the future. It's a time travel episode, sure, but the real genius of it is what it says about Squidward's relationship with his own life. In the future, everything is chrome. Everything is perfect. Everything is clean and orderly, and exactly the way Squidward always wanted the world to be, and he hates it. He hates it because perfection, it turns out, is boring. He hates it because a world without SpongeBob and Patrick, a world without the chaos and the irritation and the constant intrusion on his solitude, is a world without texture, a world without life. And the episode doesn't spell this out. It doesn't have Squidward give a speech about missing his neighbors. It just lets you feel it through his growing unease, through the emptiness of the chrome future, through the profound wrongness of a Squidward who got everything he wanted and realized it was nothing. That's an episode about existential loneliness. For kids, on a Saturday morning. And it works because the Golden Age team understood that you don't have to dumb down ideas for young audiences. You just have to present them through characters and situations that kids can connect with emotionally, even if they can't fully articulate what the episode is about until they're 30 and re-watching it at midnight. And one more, because I can't help myself. Idiot Box, Season 3, Episode 4B, aired March 1st, 2002. SpongeBob and Patrick buy a giant television, throw away the television, and play inside the empty box it came in. They use their imagination to go on adventures inside the box, and the sounds of their adventures are real, like genuinely audible from outside the box, even though there's nothing in there but SpongeBob, Patrick, and their imagination. Squidward can't figure out how they're doing it. He's infuriated by it. He climbs into the box himself at the end, and nothing happens, because Squidward doesn't know how to play. He doesn't know how to let go and just imagine. I've thought about Idiot Box a lot, and I think it might be the most SpongeBob episode of all SpongeBob episodes, because it's about the fundamental divide between people who can access joy and people who can't. SpongeBob can sit in an empty box and have the time of his life. Squidward can't. And the show doesn't judge Squidward for this. Not really. It just observes, with this gentle sadness underneath the comedy, that some people have lost the ability to play, and that losing that ability costs them something they can never get back. That's the show's entire philosophy in 11 minutes. That's what Hillenburg was saying, over and over, through 100 different stories. The ability to find joy in nothing is the most valuable ability a person can have. There's a moment in Graveyard Shift, Season 2, Episode 16A, aired September 6th, 2002, that I want to talk about, because I think it illustrates this perfectly. The episode is a horror parody where Squidward tells SpongeBob the story of the hash-slinging slasher to scare him during a late-night shift at the Krusty Krab. And there's a sequence toward the end where the lights in the Krusty Krab start flickering on and off. And Squidward, who made up the hash-slinging slasher story to mess with SpongeBob, starts to realize that the things he described are actually happening. And the way that sequence is animated, the way the shadows move, the way Squidward's face shifts from smug to confused to genuinely terrified, the way the background music drops out, and all you hear is the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. That's horror filmmaking. That's not a cartoon being silly about being scary. That's a cartoon genuinely understanding how to build tension and release it. And it works because the people making it had a sophisticated understanding of visual storytelling that goes way beyond what you'd expect from a kids' show about sea creatures. Okay, I've been going on about the Golden Age for a while now, and I know you can probably feel where this is heading. Because this isn't a video about what SpongeBob got right. It's a video about what went wrong. And to understand what went wrong, we need to talk about 2004. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie released on November 19th, 2004. Stephen Hillenburg directed it, co-wrote it, and treated it as the definitive ending to the series. He had stopped production on the TV show in 2002 to focus on the film, and his intention was clear. This was the finale. In the movie, SpongeBob and Patrick go on an epic quest. SpongeBob gets his driver's license, he saves Bikini Bottom, and he becomes the manager of the Krusty Krab 2. It was a conclusion, a proper one. SpongeBob's arc, such as it was complete. He'd proven himself. He'd grown up, just a little. The story was done. But here's the thing about Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon didn't care that the story was done. They couldn't afford to. By 2004, SpongeBob SquarePants was the most valuable property Nickelodeon had. The merchandise alone was generating billions. The show regularly pulled in 7 to 8 million viewers per episode. The network was scheduling SpongeBob reruns to fill 30 to 40% of its total programming time. Ending SpongeBob wasn't a creative decision to Nickelodeon. It was a financial one. And financially, ending SpongeBob was suicide. Hillenburg knew this was coming. He'd said in interviews that he wanted to end the show so it wouldn't jump the shark. He could see the pressure building. Nickelodeon executives had actually told him during the movie's production that they thought the show had peaked, which is an incredible thing to say to someone about their own creation, and somehow managed to simultaneously believe that the show had peaked and that they needed to keep making more of it anyway. And what happened next is the part that still makes me angry. Every single time I think about it. Hillenburg stepped back. He resigned as showrunner. He stayed on as executive producer, which meant his name was still in the credits. But the day-to-day creative control of SpongeBob SquarePants passed to Paul Tibbitt. Tibbitt had been a writer, director, and storyboard artist on the show during the Golden Age, so he wasn't some random outsider. He was a talented guy who understood the show. But he wasn't Stephen Hillenburg. Nobody was. And the show that came back for Season 4 on May 6th, 2005, with the episodes Fear of a Krabby Patty and Shell of a Man, was recognizably SpongeBob in its surface features. Same characters, same setting, same voice actors, same theme song, but something underneath had shifted. Something fundamental had changed, and you could feel it almost immediately. Here's where our two tracks diverge, and I want to be really precise about this because the conversation about SpongeBob's decline tends to get flattened into this simple narrative of good before movie, bad after movie, and the reality is messier than that. The creative track and the corporate track split at the same moment, but they decay at different speeds and for different reasons. And understanding that distinction is important if you want to understand what actually happened. On the creative track, what happened in Season 4 wasn't an immediate catastrophe. It was a slow erosion. The animation was still strong. The voice performances were still excellent because Tom Kenny, Bill Fagerbakke, Roger Bumpass, Clancy Brown, Mr. Lawrence, and Carolyn Lawrence are world-class talents who brought everything they had to every recording session, regardless of the quality of the material they were given. The settings were the same, the music was similar, but the writing had shifted in ways that were subtle at first, and became increasingly pronounced over time. The first thing that changed was the humor. In the Golden Age, SpongeBob's comedy operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There were the visual gags for kids, the wordplay for older viewers, the absurdist setups that worked regardless of your age, and then these subtle, dark, almost subversive undercurrents that rewarded close attention. The show trusted its audience. It assumed you were smart enough to get the joke, and if you didn't get it on the first viewing, it would be there waiting for you on the rewatch. Post-movie, the humor started to flatten. Jokes became louder, more obvious, more reliant on reaction shots and physical grossness rather than timing and character dynamics. The show wasn't trusting its audience anymore. It was screaming at them. And I want to be fair here. Season 4 has some genuinely good episodes. Have You Seen This Snail? Season 4, Episode 3, aired November 11th, 2005, is a half-hour special about Gary running away after SpongeBob neglects to feed him. And it's a legitimately emotional, well-crafted piece of television. It's proof that the show could still hit when it swung for the fences, but it's also proof of how much harder it had to swing to get there. In the Golden Age, that level of emotional resonance was standard. In Season 4, it was an event. On the corporate track, meanwhile, Nickelodeon was doing what corporations do when they find a revenue stream. They were optimizing it. More episodes, faster turnaround, more merchandise tie-ins, more cross-promotion, more reruns. The show was being squeezed for every possible dollar, and the creative team was under pressure to produce content at a pace that left less and less room for the kind of meticulous, detail-obsessed craftsmanship that had defined the first 3 seasons. Hillenburg had been famously hands-on. He'd review storyboards personally. He'd give detailed notes on background paintings. He'd spend time ensuring that every visual gag landed exactly right. Without him at the helm, and with the production schedule accelerating, that level of care became impossible to maintain. Not because the people working on the show didn't care. Many of them cared deeply. But because the system they were operating within had different priorities. And this is the thing that I think gets missed most often in conversations about the decline. It's easy to blame individual writers or individual episodes. It's easy to point at a specific scene and say, this is where it went wrong. But the real problem was structural. The real problem was that Nickelodeon had turned SpongeBob SquarePants from a creative project into a content pipeline. And content pipelines have different rules than creative projects. In a creative project, you take the time you need to get it right. In a content pipeline, you ship on schedule and fix it in the next batch. Except in animation, there is no fixing it in the next batch. Once an episode airs, it's canon. It's part of the show. And the show's identity is the sum of all its parts. And there's another element of the creative track that I want to spend some time on, because it connects to the corporate track in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The writing staff changed, not all at once, but gradually. The writers and storyboard artists who had built the Golden Age left, or were reassigned. In animation, especially at Nickelodeon, the storyboard-driven model means that the storyboard artists are effectively the primary writers of each episode. They take a rough outline and turn it into a fully realized 11-minute script through the storyboard process, making thousands of creative decisions along the way about timing, visual gags, character expressions, and dialogue. The Golden Age had a specific team of storyboard artists who understood the show's DNA because they'd helped build it. Aaron Springer, C.H. Greenblatt, Eric Weezy, and others. They knew instinctively what SpongeBob would do in a given situation because they'd been drawing him doing things for years. They knew how long a beat should be held because they'd held 1,000 beats before. They knew the show's rules, its boundaries, its rhythms. When those artists left and new ones came in, that institutional knowledge didn't transfer. It couldn't, because the show's DNA wasn't written in a Bible or a style guide. It was encoded in the accumulated experience of the people who made it. And the new artists, however talented they were individually, had to learn the show's voice by studying what came before, rather than by having helped create it. And the difference between those two things, between knowing a show because you made it and knowing a show because you watched it is the difference between speaking a language as a native speaker and speaking it as a second language. You can become fluent. You can become very, very good. But there are always going to be moments where the idiom is slightly off, where the rhythm doesn't quite land, where the phrasing feels translated rather than organic. And you know what? This is one of those things I think about at 2 a.m. sometimes. The specific way that creative knowledge gets lost when teams turn over. Because it's not just SpongeBob. It happens in every creative industry. A restaurant changes chefs, and the dishes look the same, but taste different. A band replaces a member, and the songs still chart, but something in the chemistry is gone. A comic book switches writers, and the characters say the right words in the wrong voice. There's a phenomenon in organizational psychology called tacit knowledge loss, where the most valuable knowledge in any operation isn't the stuff that's written down in manuals and guidelines. It's the stuff that lives in people's heads, the intuitions and instincts and accumulated judgment that come from years of doing the same thing and getting better at it. And when those people leave, that knowledge goes with them, and no amount of documentation can replace it. SpongeBob's golden age was built on tacit knowledge, Hillenburg's sense of what was funny, what was too far, what needed more room, what needed less. That knowledge was never codified because it couldn't be. It was too granular, too situational, too dependent on Hillenburg's specific sensibility. And when he left, it evaporated. I actually think Season 5 is where you can most clearly hear that second language quality. It's the season where the show starts making mistakes that aren't about ambition or effort, but about comprehension. Episodes that don't quite understand why a similar premise worked in Season 2. Character interactions that hit the notes, but miss the music. Jokes that are structured correctly, but timed wrong. It's the uncanny valley of SpongeBob. Close enough to the real thing that you can see what they were going for. Different enough that something feels off in a way you can't always name. Let me talk about what flanderization actually looks like in practice, because I think the term gets thrown around a lot without people really sitting with what it means. Flanderization, named after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, is the process by which a fictional character's personality is progressively reduced to 1 or 2 exaggerated traits over the course of a series. And SpongeBob SquarePants is one of the most severe cases of flanderization in the history of television. Not just for one character, for the entire cast. Let's start with SpongeBob himself. In seasons 1 through 3, SpongeBob is enthusiastic, optimistic, slightly eccentric, and deeply loyal to his friends. He's naive in some ways, but he's not stupid. He can be clever, he can be self-aware, and crucially, he understands social situations, even when he chooses to respond to them in his own idiosyncratic way. He knows Squidward is annoyed by him. He just chooses not to let that change how he treats Squidward, because SpongeBob's worldview is fundamentally about choosing kindness, even when it's not reciprocated. That's a sophisticated character trait. That's a character choice that works on multiple levels, as comedy, as philosophy, as genuine human behavior rendered in animated form. Starting in Season 4 and accelerating dramatically through Seasons 5, 6, and 7, SpongeBob became progressively less sophisticated and more childlike. Not childlike in the charming, seeing the world with fresh eyes way. Childlike in the unable to function as an adult way. His enthusiasm stopped being a worldview and started being a symptom. His interactions with Squidward stopped being the push and pull of 2 fundamentally different people who are nonetheless stuck together, and started being straight up harassment. He became louder, whinier, more clingy, more oblivious to the damage he was causing. And the show seemed unable or unwilling to recognize the difference between a character who chooses joy and a character who's incapable of anything else. And I want to give a specific example of this, because I think seeing the contrast episode to episode makes it visceral in a way that abstract analysis can't. In the Golden Age episode Squid's Day Off, Season 2, Episode 9A, aired November 2nd, 2001, Squidward leaves SpongeBob in charge of the Krusty Krab for the first time. And the episode is about Squidward's inability to enjoy his day off because he can't stop worrying about what SpongeBob is doing to the restaurant. He keeps going back to check, and every time he checks, SpongeBob is fine. The restaurant is fine. The problem is entirely in Squidward's head, and the comedy comes from this beautifully observed truth about anxiety. The person who can't stop worrying is always more damaged by the worry itself than by whatever they're worried about. SpongeBob in that episode is competent. He's capable. He's cheerfully doing his job. The joke isn't that SpongeBob is an idiot. The joke is that Squidward can't relax. That's a fundamentally different kind of comedy from what the post-movie era would do with the same setup. In a post-movie version of this scenario, SpongeBob would actually destroy the Krusty Krab. He would be shown as genuinely incompetent. The comedy would come from chaos and destruction rather than from character. Squidward's anxiety would be justified rather than ironic. And the episode would lose everything that makes Squid's Day Off special, which is the subtlety of its observational humor and the complexity of its character dynamics. The Golden Age version says, Squidward's problem is that he can't trust anyone. The post-movie version would say, Squidward's problem is that SpongeBob is an idiot. One of those is a human insight. The other is a cartoon premise. And honestly, that's what makes me angriest about the decline. Because SpongeBob's optimism, real SpongeBob's optimism, the kind Hillenburg created, is one of the most beautiful things in the history of animation. It's a genuine philosophical position rendered as a cartoon character. And what the post-movie seasons did to it is the equivalent of taking a painting and turning it into a poster. The shape is the same, the colors are similar, but everything that made it art is gone. Let me tell you about Patrick, because Patrick's flanderization might actually be the most destructive one. In the Golden Age, Patrick is SpongeBob's best friend, and he's not smart. That's the joke. But he's also loyal. He's emotionally intuitive in surprising moments, and his stupidity has a kind of innocent wisdom to it. There are moments in the early seasons where Patrick says something profoundly dumb that accidentally illuminates something true. His stupidity is a comedy tool, not his entire identity. He's a person first and a dummy second. In the post-movie era, Patrick became exclusively and aggressively stupid. Not endearingly dumb. Maliciously dumb. There are episodes in seasons 6 and 7 where Patrick's behavior crosses the line from comedy into something that feels genuinely mean-spirited. He becomes selfish, destructive, and cruel in ways that the early version of the character never was. And because the show lost the ability to distinguish between stupid funny and stupid mean, Patrick's screen time in the later seasons started to feel exhausting rather than entertaining. You stopped laughing with him and started enduring him. Mr. Krabs. Here's the thing about Mr. Krabs in the Golden Age. He's greedy. That's his thing. But his greed exists alongside genuine affection for his daughter Pearl, grudging respect for SpongeBob, and a complicated relationship with his rival Plankton that has undertones of genuine history and mutual understanding. He's a boss you'd complain about, but ultimately work for because there are moments where he shows that he actually does care, even if those moments are rare, and quickly followed by something cheap and selfish. That's a real character. That's someone you recognize from your own life. Post-movie Mr. Krabs is a monster. I don't use that word lightly. His greed went from a character trait to a defining pathology that overrides every other aspect of his personality. There are episodes where he's willing to literally endanger SpongeBob's life to save money. There are episodes where his treatment of Squidward crosses from comedic exploitation into something that would constitute workplace abuse in any real-world context. And the worst example, the one that I think represents the absolute nadir of what Mr. Krabs became, is One Course Meal, Season 7, Episode 11A, which aired on March 25th, 2010. In One Course Meal, Mr. Krabs discovers that Plankton is afraid of whales, so he disguises himself as his daughter Pearl to terrorize Plankton into staying away from the Krusty Krab. Not just scare him once, terrorize him, repeatedly, over days, to the point where Plankton has nightmares, can't sleep, and eventually lies down in the middle of the road, hoping to be run over. That's the joke. The joke is that Mr. Krabs bullied his business rival into wanting to die, and the show plays it for laughs. SpongeBob witnesses this and does nothing meaningful to stop it. The episode ends without any real consequences for Mr. Krabs. I've watched a lot of SpongeBob. I mean, a lot. And One Course Meal might be the episode that pisses me off the most. Not because it's the worst in terms of craft, though it's pretty bad, but because it represents a fundamental betrayal of what these characters are supposed to be. Mr. Krabs in the Golden Age would never do this. Not because he's a saint, but because the show understood that comedy requires a sense of proportion, and driving someone to suicidal ideation isn't proportional to any joke. The people who wrote this episode either didn't understand the character they were writing, or they understood him and chose to make him worse because shock value was easier to write than genuine humor. And here's the other thread, pulling tight at the same time. While the creative quality was declining, Nickelodeon's exploitation of the franchise was accelerating. By 2011, SpongeBob programming accounted for somewhere between 31 and 40% of Nickelodeon's total programming. Think about that. A single show was filling nearly half the network's airtime. That's not a programming strategy. That's a dependency. Nickelodeon wasn't a network that aired SpongeBob. It was the SpongeBob network that occasionally aired other things. And the ratings reflected this dependency in a complicated way. The show was still pulling in massive numbers by cable television standards. Season 7 was averaging around 4 to 6 million viewers per episode for new episodes. But the growth had stopped. The cultural conversation had shifted. People weren't talking about new SpongeBob episodes with excitement anymore. They were talking about how far the show had fallen. Fan communities that had spent years celebrating every new episode were now picking each one apart, cataloging the flanderization, tracking the decline in animation quality, creating tier lists that placed everything after Season 3 in the lowest categories. The Golden Age had become a point of comparison that made everything after it look worse by contrast, and the show itself seemed unable or unwilling to address that. And since we're talking about Squidward, let me spend a minute on what the post-movie era did to his relationship with SpongeBob, because this is something that genuinely upsets me, and I need to talk about it. In the Golden Age, SpongeBob and Squidward have one of the most nuanced relationships in animated television. SpongeBob genuinely likes Squidward and wants to be his friend. Squidward is genuinely annoyed by SpongeBob and wants to be left alone. But the show understands that both of these positions are valid. SpongeBob isn't wrong to extend friendship. Squidward isn't wrong to want boundaries. The comedy comes from the collision of these two equally valid positions, and the show is smart enough to let both characters be right, which means neither one is reduced to a villain or a victim. There are episodes where Squidward is clearly in the wrong, episodes where SpongeBob crosses a line, and episodes where neither of them is at fault, and the situation is just inherently funny. The relationship breathes. It has room for complexity. And in the best episodes, like Pizza Delivery, like Band Geeks, like Dying for Pie, the show reveals that underneath the irritation and the neediness, there's something real between them. Not friendship in the traditional sense. Something stranger and more interesting. A kind of involuntary intimacy that comes from proximity and shared experience. The same thing that exists between coworkers who have been stuck together long enough to know each other's rhythms, even if they'd never choose to spend time together outside of work. In the post-movie era, that nuance collapsed. SpongeBob's affection for Squidward became obsessive and invasive. He stopped being a friendly neighbor and started being a stalker. There are episodes in seasons 6 and 7 where SpongeBob's behavior towards Squidward would qualify as harassment by any reasonable standard, and the show doesn't seem to realize this. He follows Squidward everywhere, invades his home, disrupts his hobbies, destroys his property, and the show treats all of this as harmless or even endearing. Meanwhile, Squidward's responses to SpongeBob's intrusions became more extreme and more justified, which created this weird dynamic where the audience is actively rooting against the main character. That's a fundamental structural problem. If your audience is siding with the guy who wants the protagonist to go away, your protagonist has a characterization issue. There's an episode called Boating Buddies, Season 6, Episode 9A, where SpongeBob literally follows Squidward everywhere, including into his own bathroom, and the episode frames Squidward's discomfort as the joke, not SpongeBob's intrusiveness. Squidward's discomfort. The show has switched sides. In the Golden Age, the show was sympathetic to both characters. In Boating Buddies, the show is sympathetic only to SpongeBob, which means it's sympathetic to the harassment, which means it has lost the plot entirely. And this isn't an isolated example. This dynamic, SpongeBob as oblivious aggressor and Squidward as legitimate victim, plays out across dozens of post-movie episodes. The writers seem to have decided that SpongeBob bothering Squidward is inherently funny, regardless of context, regardless of degree, regardless of whether the audience is laughing with SpongeBob or cringing at him. And the answer, increasingly, was cringing. I want to talk about Sandy Cheeks for a minute too, because what happened to Sandy is a quieter kind of tragedy than what happened to SpongeBob or Squidward, but it's just as revealing. In the Golden Age, Sandy is a scientist, an inventor, a martial arts expert, and one of the most competent characters in Bikini Bottom. She's there because she chose to be there, because she's interested in the underwater world and wants to study it and understand it. She's from Texas. She has a strong personality. She can take care of herself, and her friendship with SpongeBob is based on mutual respect and genuine affection. She's probably the most well-rounded female character on Nickelodeon in the early 2000s, which isn't a high bar, but Sandy clears it with room to spare. In the post-movie era, Sandy became a one-note Texas stereotype. Her scientific curiosity was reduced to an occasional plot device. Her relationship with SpongeBob lost its warmth and became transactional. She appeared less frequently, and when she did appear, she was often used as a vehicle for lazy jokes about Texas or karate, rather than as a fully realized character with her own perspective and her own arc. The show didn't seem to know what to do with Sandy once it stopped treating her as a person and started treating her as a prop. And I think this reflects the broader flanderization problem in miniature. When you reduce your characters to their most obvious traits, the characters who don't have immediately obvious comedic traits get sidelined entirely. SpongeBob is happy. Patrick is dumb. Squidward is miserable. Mr. Krabs is greedy. Those are easy to flanderize. But Sandy's defining trait is competence. And competence isn't as easy to exaggerate into absurdity. So instead of flanderizing her, the show just forgot about her. I need to talk about the specific kinds of humor that replaced the Golden Age's multi-layered comedy, because I think this is where you can most clearly see the creative deterioration. There are 3 trends that dominate the post-movie seasons, and each one represents a different kind of failure. The first is gross-out humor. Early SpongeBob occasionally had moments of visual grossness, but they were always in service of something. They were punchlines, not premises. In the post-movie era, gross-out humor became a primary comedy strategy. The most infamous example is The Splinter, Season 6, Episode 5A, which aired on June 2nd, 2008, in which SpongeBob gets a splinter at work, and the episode devotes its runtime to showing the splinter in increasingly graphic, infection-riddled detail. It's not funny. It's not clever. It's just disgusting. And here's the kicker. Tom Kenny himself has publicly said that The Splinter is his least favorite episode of the entire series. When the voice of SpongeBob thinks your episode went too far, you've got a problem. The second is cruelty humor. Golden Age SpongeBob had conflict, obviously. Characters argued, characters got hurt, characters suffered. But there was always a sense of proportion and consequence. If something bad happened to a character, the show acknowledged it. The suffering wasn't the joke itself. In the post-movie era, cruelty became the punchline. Squidward's misery, which in the early seasons was always balanced by moments of genuine sympathy from the show itself, became a spectacle. The show started to take pleasure in Squidward's suffering in a way that felt mean rather than comedic. And this is connected to the flanderization problem. Because once you reduce Squidward to nothing but a punching bag, once you strip away the complexity that made his misery both funny and poignant, what you're left with isn't comedy. It's just punishment. The third is random humor. The Golden Age's absurdism was always grounded in character logic. Things happened for reasons, even if those reasons were themselves absurd. Post-movie SpongeBob increasingly relied on randomness as a comedy strategy. Things happening for no reason. Jokes that didn't connect to anything. Scenes that existed solely to fill time. And I think this is the trend that's most diagnostic of the underlying creative problem. Because randomness is what you get when you don't have a strong creative vision guiding the show. Randomness is the default mode of a writer's room that's producing content on a schedule without a unifying sensibility, telling them what the show is actually about. And I know I keep going back to specific episodes, but I think there's one more from the Dark Era that I need to talk about because it represents yet another failure mode that the Golden Age never would have allowed. Squid Baby, Season 9, Episode 3B, which aired on September 3rd, 2012. In this episode, Squidward hits his head and mentally regresses to infancy. SpongeBob and Patrick then take care of him, changing his diapers, feeding him, treating a full-grown octopus like a literal baby. And the episode plays this entirely for laughs. An adult character with a traumatic brain injury behaving like an infant is presented as the comedic premise, not as something concerning or empathetic, but as something funny. SpongeBob changes Squidward's diaper in the Krusty Krab kitchen. Mr. Krabs doesn't care about Squidward's condition and forces him to work the register despite his infantile state. I sat with this episode for a long time, trying to figure out why it bothered me so much more than other bad post-movie episodes. And I think the answer is that it represents a total collapse of the show's moral framework. In the Golden Age, SpongeBob's world has a moral logic. Good things happen to characters who earn them. Bad things happen for reasons that make sense within the show's universe. Suffering is acknowledged, even when it's played for comedy. In Squid Baby, none of that applies. A character suffers a serious injury, and the show treats the consequences as a sight gag. There's no empathy, no acknowledgement that what's happening to Squidward is bad, no resolution that addresses the fundamental wrongness of the situation. It's just 11 minutes of a brain-damaged character in a diaper being humiliated by people who are supposed to be his friends. And that's not SpongeBob. That's not the show Hillenburg built. That's something else entirely wearing SpongeBob's skin. I want to take a minute here, because I've been coming down pretty hard on the post-movie era, and I want to acknowledge something important. Making 11 minutes of animated comedy is incredibly hard. It requires writers, storyboard artists, animators, voice actors, composers, and editors all working in concert. And the people who worked on SpongeBob during its decline were, many of them, genuinely talented individuals doing their best within a system that was set up to prioritize quantity over quality. Paul Tibbitt, who ran the show from Season 4 through Season 9, was not a bad showrunner. He's a talented artist and writer who had the impossible task of continuing a show that its creator had already concluded. The writers, the storyboard artists, the animators, many of them had been on the show since the Golden Age and were doing the best work they could under the circumstances. The decline of SpongeBob wasn't caused by a lack of talent. It was caused by a structural problem. The removal of the singular creative vision that made the show cohere, combined with corporate pressure to produce more content faster. And I keep coming back to this, because it's the key to the whole thing. Stephen Hillenburg wasn't just a good showrunner. He was the organizing principle of the entire show. He was the person who knew, instinctively, when a joke went too far, when a character moment needed more room to breathe, when an episode was relying on shock instead of craft. He was the quality filter. And when he stepped back, the show lost its immune system. Individual episodes could still be good, sometimes very good, but the show as a whole lost the ability to self-correct. Bad instincts that Hillenburg would have caught went unchecked. Tonal mistakes that he would have fixed in storyboard review made it to air. And over time, those mistakes accumulated and compounded until the show became something that its creator would barely recognize. Let me talk about A Pal for Gary, because I think it's the episode that best illustrates everything wrong with the post-movie era in a single 11-minute block. A Pal for Gary is Season 7, Episode 5B, aired January 2nd, 2010. The premise: SpongeBob feels bad about leaving Gary home alone while he works, so he buys another pet, a creature called Puffy Fluffy, to keep Gary company. Despite being explicitly warned that Puffy Fluffy is dangerous, SpongeBob buys it anyway. And then, over the course of the episode, Puffy Fluffy terrorizes Gary, grows into a horrifying monster, and nearly eats Gary alive. And SpongeBob, throughout all of this, blames Gary. Not Puffy Fluffy, Gary. He scolds Gary for not being nice to the creature that is actively trying to kill him. This episode is bad for obvious reasons. The gross-out monster design, the thin premise, the lack of humor. But the deeper problem, the reason it represents the decline so perfectly, is what it does to SpongeBob's character. Golden Age. SpongeBob loves Gary more than almost anything in the world. Gary is his best friend, his companion, the living thing he's most responsible for. The idea that SpongeBob would watch a monster attack Gary and then scold Gary for defending himself is so fundamentally at odds with who SpongeBob is supposed to be that it breaks the character. It's not just a bad episode. It's an episode that actively damages the audience's relationship with the main character of the show. And the fact that it aired, that it made it through the entire production pipeline without anyone saying, "Wait, SpongeBob wouldn't do this," tells you everything you need to know about what the show had become by season 7. You know what's funny? And not funny, haha. I keep thinking about a specific comparison. Imagine if in the middle of a Golden Age episode, SpongeBob had watched someone hurt Gary and done nothing. The audience would have known immediately that something was wrong. They would have felt the wrongness in their bones, because the show had spent dozens of episodes establishing exactly how SpongeBob feels about his snail. That's the difference between a show with a coherent creative vision and a show without one. In the first case, character violations feel wrong because the show itself knows who its characters are. In the second case, character violations happen all the time, and nobody catches them because nobody is sure anymore who these characters are supposed to be. I need to shift gears here, because there's another dimension to this whole thing that I haven't touched on yet, and it's the one that I think connects the creative decline to something bigger. I want to talk about what SpongeBob's decline says about the television industry more broadly, about the way networks treat their most valuable properties, and about the fundamental tension between art and commerce that sits at the heart of every long-running animated series. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. What happened to SpongeBob isn't unique. It happens to almost every successful animated show that runs long enough. The Simpsons went through it. Family Guy went through it. Fairly Odd Parents went through it. The pattern is almost identical every time. A show starts with a strong creative vision, finds a massive audience, becomes the financial engine of its network, and then the network's need for content overwhelms the creative team's ability to maintain quality. The showrunner burns out or moves on. The original writers leave. New writers come in who understand the show's surface, but not its depths. And the result is a gradual, relentless dilution of everything that made the show special. What makes SpongeBob's case particularly painful is the degree to which Hillenburg tried to prevent it. He didn't just get tired of the show and wander off. He actively tried to end it at its peak. He made a movie that was designed to serve as a definitive conclusion. He stepped back specifically because he didn't want the show to decline under his name. And Nickelodeon overruled him. The network that had given him the platform to create something extraordinary then used that platform to extend the show beyond the point where he believed it could maintain its quality. And the worst part? They were right to be concerned about the commercial consequences of ending the show. SpongeBob was, and remains, the single most valuable property in Nickelodeon's portfolio. Ending it would have been financially catastrophic for the network. But the decision to continue it, without the person who made it great, was creatively catastrophic for the show. And I don't think there's any way to reconcile those two truths. Let's stay on this corporate track for a while, because what Nickelodeon did after the first movie is a masterclass in how to monetize a creative property into the ground. By the mid-2000s, SpongeBob merchandise was generating somewhere north of $8 billion annually. SpongeBob was on everything. T-shirts, backpacks, lunchboxes, bed sheets, shoes, video games, theme park rides, ice cream bars shaped like his head. The character had become so commercially ubiquitous that he was almost inescapable. And this commercial saturation had an effect on the show itself that I don't think gets talked about enough. When a character becomes a brand, the brand starts to constrain the character. SpongeBob the brand is relentlessly positive, always smiling, always happy, always safe. SpongeBob the character, the real one, the Hillenburg one, is more complicated than that. He has bad days. He gets frustrated. He gets genuinely hurt by Squidward's rejection. He experiences self-doubt. He cries, not cute tears, real tears. the kind that make you feel something. But SpongeBob the brand can't have bad days, because bad days don't sell lunchboxes. So as the brand grew, the character simplified. And as the character simplified, the show simplified along with it. The corporate and creative tracks converged on a version of SpongeBob that was safe, marketable, and creatively dead. And I realize I've been talking about the corporate exploitation of SpongeBob in fairly abstract terms. So let me give you some concrete examples of what that exploitation looked like in practice. By the late 2000s, Nickelodeon was releasing SpongeBob home video compilations at a rate of 5 or 6 per year. Not full season box sets, mind you, but themed compilations with names like SpongeBob's Frozen Face-Off and SpongeBob's Atlantis SquarePants, each containing a handful of episodes curated to tie into whatever marketing campaign Nickelodeon was running at the time. The show was being sliced up and repackaged like a commodity. Its episodes treated not as individual works of art, but as interchangeable units of content that could be assembled and reassembled to maximize retail value. And the TV specials. Oh, the TV specials. Nickelodeon started commissioning special-length SpongeBob episodes, half hours and full hours, designed not as creative opportunities, but as marketing events. Truth or Square, a 1-hour special that aired on November 6th, 2009, was promoted with appearances from celebrities like Tina Fey, Robin Williams, LeBron James, and others. It was a ratings play, and the ratings were strong, around 7.7 million viewers, because the SpongeBob brand was still powerful enough to draw audiences, even when the product itself was mediocre. But the special itself was widely criticized by fans as a hollow, overstuffed mess that sacrificed everything that made SpongeBob special in favor of celebrity cameos and cross-promotional tie-ins. It was the epitome of the corporate track overwhelming the creative track, a show that existed to be an event rather than to be good. And the video games. Between 2001 and 2020, there were dozens of SpongeBob video games across every platform imaginable. Some of them, particularly Battle for Bikini Bottom from 2003 and its 2020 remaster, Rehydrated, were genuinely good and reflected an understanding of what made the show work. But many of them were cash grab tie-ins, rushed to market to coincide with movie releases or holiday shopping seasons, bearing SpongeBob's face without any of his soul. And each one diluted the brand just a little more, taught consumers to see SpongeBob as a logo rather than a character, and reinforced the idea that SpongeBob's SquarePants was a product line rather than a television show. I think about what it must have been like for the people working on the show during this period. You're a writer or a storyboard artist, and you're trying to make good SpongeBob episodes. And meanwhile, the character you're writing for is on lunchboxes and underwear and roller coasters and popsicle sticks and cereal boxes and every surface that can hold an image. The character doesn't belong to you, or to the show, or even to Nickelodeon in any meaningful creative sense. The character belongs to the market. And writing for a character who belongs to the market is fundamentally different from writing for a character who belongs to a story, because the market wants the character to be consistent, predictable, recognizable. The market wants SpongeBob to be SpongeBob every single time. No surprises, no growth, no risk. And good storytelling requires exactly the opposite. Good storytelling requires characters to surprise you, to grow, to take risks, to do things you didn't expect. The tension between those two demands, between market consistency and narrative surprise, is one of the hidden forces driving SpongeBob's decline. And it's one that nobody involved could fully resolve, because it's built into the structure of the system. And Hillenburg himself was deeply uncomfortable with this. There's a quote from him, from a New York Times interview, where he talked about his biggest fear being that one day he'd be at the beach and one of those SpongeBob dolls would wash up on the shore like garbage. Think about that for a second. The man who created SpongeBob SquarePants, a character born from a genuine love of the ocean and marine life, was worried that the commercial exploitation of his creation would literally pollute the environment that inspired it. That's not just ironic, that's tragic. I want to come back to the creative track now, because something happened around season 9 that complicates the simple decline narrative. Around 2015, the quality of the show started to improve. Not dramatically, not back to golden age levels, but noticeably. The flanderization eased up somewhat. the gross-out humor became less prevalent. The characterization started to feel a little more grounded. And the reason for this shift was that Stephen Hillenburg came back. Not as showrunner, not in the day-to-day hands-on way he'd run the show during seasons 1 through 3, but in a more active executive producer role. He was reviewing scripts and storyboards again, giving notes, providing creative direction. Mark Ceccarelli and Vincent Waller took over as co-showrunners from Paul Tibbitt in 2015. And with Hillenburg's renewed involvement, the show started to right itself. Season 9B, which is the unofficial designation for the second half of Season 9, produced some episodes that fans received positively. The show wasn't back to its peak, but it was better. The characters felt more like themselves. The humor had more layers. The cruelty had diminished. You could feel Hillenburg's presence in the material, even if he wasn't directing every frame the way he used to. And then, on March 13th, 2017, Hillenburg announced publicly that he had been diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, a progressive neurological condition with no cure. And his statement about the diagnosis, the statement he put out publicly, included these words, which I've thought about constantly while making this video. He said he wanted people to hear directly from him about the diagnosis, and that he intended to continue working on SpongeBob and his other passions for as long as he was able. For as long as he was able. That's a person who loved what he made. That's a person who, facing the worst possible medical diagnosis, chose to spend his remaining time and energy on the thing he'd spent his life building. And I think about the contrast between that devotion and the way Nickelodeon treated the property he devoted himself to, and it makes me furious. Because even as Hillenburg was battling a terminal illness and still trying to contribute to the show, Nickelodeon was already planning the next phase of SpongeBob as a franchise. Not a show, a franchise, a universe. An intellectual property ecosystem designed to generate revenue across multiple platforms and demographics in perpetuity. Hillenburg passed away on November 26, 2018. He was 57 years old, and within months of his death, Nickelodeon announced Camp Corral, SpongeBob's Under Years, a CG animated prequel series featuring younger versions of the SpongeBob characters at a summer camp. And the reaction from the fan community was, predictably, outrage. Paul Tibbitt, Hillenburg's hand-picked successor as showrunner, publicly criticized the show, posting that the people at Nickelodeon all knew full well that Steve would have hated this. And that's a pretty damning thing for a former showrunner to say about his own network. Now, the situation is complicated, and I want to be honest about that. Nickelodeon later claimed, through showrunner Vincent Waller, that Hillenburg had actually known about and approved of Camp Coral before his death. And maybe that's true. I don't have any way of knowing for certain. But even if Hillenburg gave a conditional blessing to the spin-off, there's a difference between approving a concept and approving what that concept became. There's a difference between saying, yes, maybe, in principle, and seeing the final product and feeling good about it. And the fact that Hillenburg spent years of his life actively resisting the commercialization and spin-off expansion of SpongeBob, the fact that he said in a 2009 interview that the show is about SpongeBob and that he didn't see any spin-offs happening, suggests that whatever approval he may have given was at minimum reluctant and at maximum coerced by circumstances. Camp Coral premiered on Paramount Plus on March 4th, 2021. The Patrick Star Show premiered on Nickelodeon on July 9th, 2021. And whatever you think about the quality of those shows, and opinions vary widely, their existence represents a fundamental shift in what SpongeBob is. It's no longer a show. It's a franchise. It's a content universe. It's a corporate strategy. And the person who created it, the person whose specific and unreplicable combination of marine biology, experimental animation, and absurdist comedy made the whole thing possible, is no longer here to have a say in any of it. Let me come back to the episodes for a while, because I've been talking a lot about big picture structural issues, and I want to get into the texture of the decline. I want to talk about what it actually feels like to watch a post-movie SpongeBob episode after spending hours with the Golden Age material, because the contrast is visceral in a way that's hard to capture in abstract terms. And I want to circle back to the Golden Age one more time here, because I think there's an element of the early show's brilliance that I haven't fully addressed. and it directly connects to why the decline felt so severe. And that's the show's approach to storytelling itself. Golden Age. SpongeBob doesn't just tell stories. It tells stories about stories. It's a show that's deeply, playfully aware of narrative conventions and takes enormous pleasure in subverting them. Take Chocolate with Nuts, Season 3, Episode 12. A. Aired June 1st, 2002. SpongeBob and Patrick decide to sell chocolate bars door to door, and every single sales attempt goes wrong in a different, escalating, increasingly absurd way. A fish screams chocolate repeatedly. A con artist sells them chocolate bar carrying bags, and then chocolate bar carrying bag carrying bags. An old woman demands SpongeBob rub chocolate on her skin because chocolate makes her live forever. The episode is structured like a sales comedy, like a buddy movie about two guys trying to hustle. But every beat is wrong. Every expectation is subverted. And by the end, the episode has achieved something that shouldn't be possible. It's a perfect comedy that is also, somehow, genuinely heartwarming. Because SpongeBob and Patrick's determination to succeed, despite having no idea what they're doing, is both hilarious and oddly inspiring. And what's the post-movie equivalent of that kind of episode? I genuinely don't know, because the post-movie era mostly stopped playing with narrative structure. Episodes became more straightforward, more predictable in their setup and payoff. The Golden Age would take a simple premise, like selling chocolate, and turn it into something deranged and beautiful. The post-movie era would take the same premise and play it straight, maybe add a gross-out gag or a mean-spirited twist, and call it a day. The creative ambition shrank. The willingness to try weird things, to let an episode go somewhere unexpected, to trust the audience to follow a joke wherever it wanted to go, all of that diminished. And what was left was competent but uninspired, workmanlike but not artistic, functional television rather than inspired television. I rewatched about 40 episodes from seasons 4 through 8 while preparing this video, and the thing that struck me most wasn't any single problem. It was the accumulation. Every episode has these small moments where you can feel the absence of the old creative sensibility. A joke that goes on too long. A character reaction that doesn't quite track. A scene that relies on screaming or gross-out imagery where the Golden Age would have used silence or a perfectly timed cut. And individually, these moments are minor, but they add up. Over the course of a season, they add up to a show that feels fundamentally different from what it used to be, even though all the surface elements are identical. And I think that's why the decline is so frustrating to talk about, and why fans get so heated about it. Because it's not like the show got replaced by a different show. It's the same show. Same characters, same voices, same setting, same opening theme. If you're not paying close attention, it looks and sounds exactly like SpongeBob. But something's wrong. Something's off. And the wrongness is subtle enough that it's hard to point to, which makes people feel like they're being gaslit. Like they're imagining the difference. Like maybe the Golden Age wasn't as good as they remember, and the new episodes aren't as bad as they seem. But they are. The difference is real. And it's not just nostalgia. It's not just growing up and looking at a kid's show with adult eyes. I've watched Golden Age episodes with fresh eyes, deliberately trying to see them without nostalgia goggles, and they hold up. They hold up because they're genuinely well made. The jokes work. The pacing works. The character dynamics work. The emotional beats land. And then I watch a season 7 episode right after, and the difference is night and day. Not because I'm predisposed to see one as better, because one is objectively, measurably, demonstrably better crafted than the other. I actually have a theory about why the decline hit SpongeBob harder than it hit some other long-running shows, and I don't think I've heard anyone else articulate it quite this way. SpongeBob's comedy is unusually dependent on timing. Not joke timing, although that's part of it. I mean temporal timing, the rhythm of how scenes unfold, the length of pauses, the speed of cuts, the duration of a held shot. In the Golden Age, the timing was impeccable. There's a specific kind of comedic beat that early SpongeBob does, where the action stops. The camera holds on a character's face for just a fraction of a second longer than you'd expect. And in that extra beat, the joke lands. It's the difference between telling someone a punchline and delivering a punchline. The words might be the same, but the timing changes everything. In the post-movie era, that timing deteriorated. Scenes that should linger are rushed. Moments that should be quick are dragged out. The rhythm is off, consistently, in a way that affects every single joke and every single emotional beat. And I think this is because timing, comedic timing at that level of precision, is one of the hardest things to teach and one of the easiest things to lose. Hillenburg had it. The team he personally trained had it. But as that team turned over, as new writers and storyboard artists came in, the institutional knowledge of how SpongeBob's timing works started to fade, and nobody was able to fully articulate or replicate it because it was never written down. It lived in Hillenburg's head. It was transmitted through his feedback on storyboards and scripts and animation. And when that feedback stopped, the timing drifted, and with it went the show's comedic identity. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and I know I keep circling this point, but I think it's the key to everything. The golden age of SpongeBob SquarePants wasn't just a collection of good episodes. It was a coherent artistic vision expressed through the medium of animated comedy. Every element, the writing, the animation, the voice performance, the music, the pacing, the visual design was in service of a single creative sensibility. And that sensibility was Stephen Hillenburg's. He wasn't just the showrunner, he was the auteur, SpongeBob. Seasons 1 through 3 is an authored work in the same way that a novel or a film is an authored work. It has a perspective, it has a philosophy, it has an aesthetic. And when you remove the author, even if you keep every other element in place, the work loses its coherence. It becomes a collection of episodes rather than a show. And I realize that might sound like I'm being too generous to one person. Like I'm ignoring the contributions of the dozens of writers and artists and performers who made the Golden Age what it was. I'm not. Those people were essential. Tom Kenny's vocal performance as SpongeBob is one of the great achievements in voice acting. Kenny has said that he voices a lot of sweet yellow characters and has described SpongeBob's voice as somewhere between a child and an adult, referencing Stan Laurel and Jerry Lewis. That performance, the warmth and energy and slightly unhinged enthusiasm of it, is irreplaceable, and Kenny has maintained it at an extraordinary level for over 25 years. Bill Fagerbakk's Patrick, Roger Bumpus's Squidward, Clancy Brown's Mr. Krabs, these performances are monuments of voice acting. The writers of the Golden Age, Aaron Springer, C.H. Greenblatt, Casey Alexander, Kent Osborne, and many others, brought incredible talent and creativity to every script. The show was a collaboration. It always has been. But collaborations need a center. They need a person who holds the vision together, who ensures that every individual contribution serves the whole. And that person was Hillenburg. Without him, the collaboration continued, the talent continued, the effort continued, but the center didn't hold, and the show flew apart in slow motion, scattering its best qualities across a decade of diminishing returns. I want to pause here and talk about something that happens in the fan community that I think is both understandable and a little unfair. There's a tendency to draw a hard line at the first movie and declare everything before it good and everything after it bad. And while I understand why people do this, and while I've been arguing that the movie does represent a genuine turning point, the reality is more nuanced than that. Season 4 isn't bad, it's different. It has good episodes and weak episodes, and the ratio of good to weak is worse than seasons 1 through 3, but better than what comes later. Season 5 is a step down from season 4, more uneven, more prone to the kind of mistakes I've been describing, but still capable of occasional excellence. Seasons 6 and 7 are where the decline hits its nadir. These are the seasons that produced The Splinter, A Pal for Gary, One Course Meal, and a host of other episodes that represent the absolute worst of post-movie SpongeBob. Season 8 is a mixed bag, with some genuine improvement in spots alongside continued weakness. And Season 9, particularly its back half, represents a genuine creative rebound that coincides with Hillenburg's increased involvement. The point is that the decline isn't a cliff, it's a slope. A long, uneven, sometimes reversible slope that reflects the complex reality of a show produced by many hands over many years under constantly shifting creative and corporate pressures. And I think it's important to acknowledge that complexity, because flattening the story into a simple before and after narrative doesn't do justice to the actual work that went into every season, good or bad. And look, I should say something here, because this is the point in the video where I want to address the people who disagree with me. There are fans who genuinely like the post-movie seasons, who have favorite episodes from Season 6 or Season 8, who think the decline narrative is overblown and that the show has always been entertaining, even if it changed. And I don't want to dismiss those people. Taste is subjective, nostalgia is complicated, and there's something genuinely condescending about telling someone that the thing they love is objectively worse than the thing you love, even when you believe it with your whole heart. So let me be clear. If you love Season 7 SpongeBob, I'm not telling you you're wrong to love it. I'm telling you that it's different from what came before, and that the difference represents a specific set of creative choices and corporate pressures that had specific consequences. You can love a diminished version of something. That doesn't mean the diminishment didn't happen. And there's another argument I hear a lot that I want to engage with, which is the idea that we judge the later seasons unfairly because we compare them to the Golden Age, and that if the Golden Age didn't exist, the later seasons would be considered perfectly good animated television. And there's some truth to that. Compared to the average Nickelodeon show in 2010, a mediocre SpongeBob episode is still better than most of the competition. But I don't think that argument holds up, because the Golden Age does exist. The standard was set. The show showed us what it was capable of. And once you know what SpongeBob can be, settling for less feels like a betrayal, not of the audience, but of the show itself. SpongeBob SquarePants doesn't deserve to be graded on a curve. It deserves to be measured against the standard it set for itself. And by that standard, the decline is undeniable. But having said all that, I also think it's important to be honest about the overall trajectory. The show got worse. It got worse in specific, identifiable, analyzable ways. And the primary cause of that decline was the removal of its creator from the creative process at the behest of a corporation that valued revenue over artistic integrity. That's the story. And no amount of nuance or caveat adding changes that fundamental truth. Let me talk about memes for a minute, because the meme thing is a genuinely interesting wrinkle in the SpongeBob decline story that I don't think gets analyzed enough. Here's what's wild. As the quality of new SpongeBob episodes declined through the late 2000s and 2010s, the show's cultural relevance didn't decline, it increased. SpongeBob became one of the most memed shows in the history of the internet. Mocking SpongeBob, where a picture of SpongeBob making a chicken-like pose is paired with text in alternating caps to indicate sarcasm, exploded on Twitter in 2017 and became one of the defining memes of that era. "Ite Emma head out," a screenshot of SpongeBob sitting up from a chair, became the default image for expressing a desire to leave an uncomfortable situation. Imagination, SpongeBob, with SpongeBob creating a rainbow with his hands, became shorthand for sarcastic commentary about unrealistic expectations. The list goes on. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night about this. In a thinking about it way, not a losing sleep way. Almost all of the major SpongeBob memes come from the Golden Age. The images, the scenes, the moments that the internet chose to immortalize are almost exclusively from seasons 1 through 3. The post-movie era, despite producing hundreds of episodes, has generated almost no lasting memes, which means that the show's cultural relevance in the 2000s and 2020s is almost entirely parasitic on the work that Hillenburg did in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The new episodes kept SpongeBob's name in the public consciousness, but the cultural material that people actually used, shared, and connected with came overwhelmingly from the era when the show was at its best. Think about what that means. It means that SpongeBob's cultural immortality is the achievement of the Golden Age, not the continuation. The post-movie seasons didn't contribute to SpongeBob's legacy. They coasted on it. And the meme phenomenon proves this in a way that's impossible to argue with, because memes are the most democratic form of cultural criticism there is. Nobody tells people which images to meme. Nobody mandates which moments become templates. The internet chose the Golden Age. spontaneously, repeatedly, overwhelmingly. And in doing so, the internet rendered a verdict on SpongeBob's decline that's more decisive than any review or think piece or fan ranking could ever be. I think about the Super Bowl thing a lot too. In February 2019, less than 3 months after Hillenburg's death, fans petitioned to have Sweet Victory from Band Geeks performed during the Super Bowl 53 halftime show. Over 1.2 million people signed the petition. It was a genuine grassroots movement, born from grief and love, and a desire to honor both Hillenburg and the show at its absolute best. And what happened? During the halftime show, a brief clip from Band Geeks aired for about 15 seconds before transitioning into Travis Scott performing Sicko Mode. 15 seconds. That's what the Super Bowl gave to a petition signed by over 1 million people in memory of a man who changed animation forever. And I want you to understand the timeline here, because it makes it worse. Hillenburg died on November 26th, 2018. The petition to play Sweet Victory at the Super Bowl was created in his honor, in the immediate aftermath of his death. The Super Bowl was on February 3rd, 2019. That's less than 10 weeks. 10 weeks between the death of the man who created the show and the moment when a billion-dollar sports event used his legacy as a 5-second transition into a trap song. And the production of the halftime show had clearly known about the petition for weeks, had clearly teased the SpongeBob connection in promotional material, and had clearly made a deliberate choice to bait the audience with the promise of Sweet Victory and then deliver something else entirely. That's not a mistake. That's a strategy. And it's the same strategy that defined Nickelodeon's approach to SpongeBob for 15 years. Leverage the audience's emotional connection to the golden age to sell them something they didn't ask for. And the fan response was furious. Not just disappointed, furious. Because those 15 seconds felt like a perfect metaphor for everything that had happened to SpongeBob. A corporation took something that people genuinely cared about, reduced it to the smallest possible gesture, used it as a bridge to something more commercially viable, and moved on. That's what Nickelodeon did to the show. That's what the Super Bowl did to the tribute. The pattern is the same. Corporate interests using people's emotional connection to SpongeBob as a delivery mechanism for things those people didn't ask for and don't want. Look, I've been running hot for a while here, and I want to pull back a little and think about this from a different angle. Because there's a question buried in all of this righteous anger that I think is worth asking honestly. Was any other outcome possible? Could SpongeBob have ended after the movie, the way Hillenburg wanted? In theory, yes. Nickelodeon could have made the financially devastating, but artistically courageous decision to let the show go out on top. They could have said, "This is perfect. Let's end here." And the show would have gone down as an unimpeachable classic. No decline, no flanderization, no a pal for Gary. Just 60 perfect episodes, and a movie, and a legacy that nobody could touch. But the thing is, Nickelodeon is a business, and businesses don't end their most profitable product because an artist says it's time. That's not how capitalism works. And while I'm genuinely angry at Nickelodeon for what they did to SpongeBob, I also think it's worth being honest about the fact that what they did is what every network in history has done with every successful show. They kept it going. They kept it going because it made money, because jobs depended on it, because shareholders expected it, because the alternative was a hole in the schedule and a hole in the budget that nothing else could fill. The system isn't designed to honor artistic vision. It's designed to maximize revenue. And within that system, continuing SpongeBob after Hillenburg's departure wasn't a betrayal. It was an inevitability. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. And I think the distinction between those two things matters. What makes SpongeBob's case uniquely painful isn't just that the show declined. It's that the decline was preventable. Not by some miraculous corporate change of heart, but by the simple act of letting the creator maintain control. If Nickelodeon had found a way to keep Hillenburg engaged, if they'd structured the production schedule around his pace rather than their revenue targets, if they'd prioritized quality over quantity, the show could have maintained its standard for much longer. Maybe not forever. Nothing lasts forever. But the gap between what SpongeBob was and what it became is so vast that it clearly represents a failure. Not of talent, not of effort, but of institutional priorities. I want to talk about the later seasons in a bit more detail, because the story doesn't end with Season 7. There's a whole second act to the decline, and it's more complicated than people give it credit for. Season 8, which ran from 2011 to 2012, is where you start to see the first signs of course correction. Not a dramatic turnaround, but a subtle shift. The worst excesses of Season 6 and 7, the most egregious gross-out humor, the most extreme character violations, start to recede. It's as if the production team looked at the fan backlash and the critical reception and realized that something needed to change. The episodes aren't great, by and large, but they're less aggressively bad than what came immediately before. There's a tentative, uncertain quality to Season 8, like the show is trying to find its footing again without quite knowing how. And then Season 9 arrives, and the improvement becomes more pronounced. As I mentioned earlier, Hillenburg's renewed involvement during the Season 9 era is widely credited with this shift, along with the new showrunning team of Mark Ceccarelli and Vincent Waller, who brought a different energy to the production. Season 9B in particular has episodes that fans have praised as genuinely good, with some critics pointing to specific episodes as evidence that the show could still work when given the right creative guidance. But here's where the two tracks converge again in a way that's deeply uncomfortable. Because even as the show was experiencing this creative rebound, even as Hillenburg was pouring what energy his illness allowed into making SpongeBob better, Nickelodeon was accelerating its franchise expansion plans. The second movie, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water, released on February 6th, 2015, and while it was a commercial success, grossing over $300 million worldwide, it also represented a shift in the franchise's visual identity, incorporating live-action and CGI elements that moved further away from the hand-drawn aesthetic that defined the show's early years. And the third movie, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge on the Run, released in 2020, went fully CGI and served as a de facto pilot for Camp Corral, SpongeBob's Underyears. And here's a detail about the Nielsen ratings during this period that I think is really telling. In 2012, Nickelodeon reported a 29% drop in SpongeBob viewership among children compared to the previous year. 29% in a single year. That's not gradual decline. That's hemorrhaging. And the network's own analysis attributed part of the decline to overexposure, to the fact that SpongeBob programming was filling so much of Nickelodeon's schedule that kids were literally getting sick of seeing the same episodes over and over. Which means Nickelodeon's strategy of running SpongeBob into the ground was actively harming the property's ability to attract viewers. They were killing the golden goose, not through creative neglect, but through overexposure, through the sheer, relentless ubiquity of a character that had been optimized for maximum visibility at the expense of everything else. And this connects to something I think is important about the later creative trajectory. By the time seasons 10, 11, and 12 came around, the show was operating in a fundamentally different television landscape. Streaming was ascendant. Kids were watching YouTube and Netflix and Disney+. The idea of appointment viewing, of sitting down at a specific time to watch a new SpongeBob episode on Nickelodeon, had become almost quaint. And the show adapted to this reality by becoming more self-aware, more referential, more willing to play with its own legacy. But that adaptation came at a cost, because a show that's constantly winking at its own history is a show that's defined by its past rather than its present. And that's a fundamentally different posture from the Golden Age, where every episode felt like it was creating something new rather than riffing on something old. I remember watching Sponge on the Run and feeling this weird dissonance, because the movie was clearly made with care. The animation was technically impressive. The story hit the emotional beats it was aiming for, but it didn't feel like SpongeBob. Not in any way I could precisely articulate at the time, but in a way that sat with me afterward. The soul was missing. The specific combination of hand-drawn warmth, absurdist humor, and emotional sincerity that made SpongeBob SpongeBob had been replaced by something shinier and smoother, and ultimately, emptier. It was SpongeBob as brand experience rather than SpongeBob as art. And this brings me to the spin-offs, which I know I've touched on already, but which I think deserve more attention, because they represent the final stage of the transformation I've been tracking through this entire video. Camp Corral and The Patrick Star Show are both in their own ways, competent television. They have talented people working on them. They have moments that work. The Patrick Star Show, in particular, found a kind of anarchic energy in its later seasons that some fans genuinely enjoyed. But neither show is SpongeBob SquarePants. They can't be. Because SpongeBob SquarePants isn't a franchise concept, or a character brand, or a setting. It's a specific creative vision that belonged to a specific person. And you can't spin off from a vision. You can only spin off from the surface elements of it. I think about Hillenburg's 2009 interview a lot, the one where he was asked about spin-offs and said the show is about SpongeBob and how he relates to the other characters, and that Patrick by himself might be too much, and that he didn't see any spin-offs happening. And I understand that circumstances changed, that Hillenburg may have softened on this position before his death, that creative people sometimes change their minds about things. But the underlying instinct, the instinct that said, SpongeBob works because of a specific dynamic between specific characters in a specific world, and that extracting individual characters from that dynamic and putting them in different contexts risks losing what makes the whole thing work. That instinct was right. It was the same instinct that made the show great in the first place. Hillenburg understood, at a fundamental level, what SpongeBob was and what it wasn't. And the franchise expansion that followed his death has systematically tested every boundary he tried to set. And I keep thinking about one more thing. And I know this is a long video, and we've covered a lot of ground. But this is important to me, and I think it's important to the story. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about this enough to hear it. There's a moment I keep going back to. It's not from any specific episode. It's from the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. The 2004 one. The Hillenburg one. Near the end of the movie, SpongeBob has been captured by Cyclops, dried out under a heat lamp, and turned into a souvenir shell. He's dead. SpongeBob, SquarePants, is dead. And then a tear falls from his eye, travels down a wire, reaches a wall outlet, short-circuits it, and triggers the sprinkler system, which rehydrates all the dried-out sea creatures in the shop. SpongeBob comes back to life. And the scene works. It genuinely works as an emotional climax because of how it's built. The tear isn't random. It's the culmination of everything SpongeBob has been through in the movie. Every moment where someone told him he was just a kid, just a fry cook, just a nobody who would never amount to anything. The tear is the weight of all that doubt, and the resurrection is the show's final thesis statement. Sincerity matters. Trying matters. Being small and ridiculous and hopelessly optimistic in a world that rewards cynicism, that matters. Hillenburg intended that to be the ending, the actual ending. SpongeBob saves the day, gets his manager position, and drives off into the sunset. Credits roll. Series over. And that would have been perfect. That would have been one of the great endings in animation history. But Nickelodeon looked at that ending and saw it as a comma, not a period. They saw revenue beyond it. And everything I've been talking about for the past however many thousands of words flows from that single decision to keep going past the ending. Okay, I've been going for a while, and I want to address something that I think the people who've made it this far deserve to hear. Because there's a version of this video that ends with unrelenting negativity, that concludes with the thesis that SpongeBob is ruined, and nothing can fix it, and everything after Season 3 is garbage, and there's no hope. And I don't want to make that video, because I don't think it's true. SpongeBob SquarePants, the Golden Age version, the real version, still exists. Nobody can take it away. Those 60-odd episodes are available to watch whenever you want, and they're just as good now as they were when they first aired. They haven't degraded. They haven't been diminished by the existence of the post-movie seasons. When I rewatch Pizza Delivery, or Band Geeks, or Chocolate with Nuts, the experience is the same as it always was. I laugh. I feel something. I'm reminded why animation is one of the most powerful storytelling mediums on the planet. And I'm grateful that Stephen Hillenburg existed and chose to spend his creative energy building this particular world. And I think that's the thing I want to hold on to. Not the anger about what the show became, although the anger is justified, and I've spent most of this video expressing it, but the gratitude for what the show was. Because SpongeBob SquarePants, at its best, is one of the great gifts that animation has given us. It's a show about a sea sponge that somehow manages to be about everything, about optimism, about friendship, about the tension between who you are and who you want to be, about finding joy in a world that gives you every reason not to, about the beauty of small moments and the absurdity of big ones, and the way that a yellow sponge in a pineapple under the sea can make you feel less alone at 2 in the morning when nothing else can. Remember what I said at the beginning about the 2 tracks? The creative soul of SpongeBob and the corporate machine that consumed it? Here's where they converge for the last time. Because what Nickelodeon ultimately did to SpongeBob is what the world does to most beautiful things. It commodified them. It took something that existed because one person loved the ocean, and loved animation, and loved making people laugh, and it turned it into a revenue stream. And in the process, it preserved the form while gutting the substance. SpongeBob still exists. SpongeBob is everywhere. But the SpongeBob that exists everywhere is the brand, not the art. The poster, not the painting. And yet, the painting is still there. Underneath all the merchandise, and the spin-offs, and the memes, and the corporate strategy, and the quarterly earnings reports, the painting is still there. 60 episodes of pure intention, made by people who cared about every frame, guided by a person who poured his entire creative soul into a show about sea creatures, and expected nothing less than perfection from everyone around him. I've been thinking about Squidward a lot while making this video. Not Golden Age Squidward or post-movie Squidward, but Squidward as a concept. Because Squidward's tragedy, the tragedy that makes him funny and sad in equal measure, is that he's talented enough to see the gap between what he is and what he could be, but not talented enough to close it. He can hear the music in his head. He just can't play it. And I think there's a version of the SpongeBob decline story that mirrors Squidward's tragedy perfectly. The post-movie team could see what the show was supposed to be. They had the golden age right there as a reference. They could hear the music. They just couldn't play it. Not because they weren't talented, because the music was Steven Hillenburg's, and he was the only one who knew all the notes. Let me tell you something personal. I started watching SpongeBob when I was a kid, like millions of other people. And like millions of other people, I stopped watching at some point during the post-movie era. Not because I decided to stop, but because the show slowly and quietly stopped being the thing I loved. Each new episode was a little less engaging, a little less funny, a little less warm, until one day I realized I hadn't watched a new episode in months and hadn't missed it. And that experience, that gradual disengagement, might be the most common SpongeBob experience of the last 15 years. Millions of people didn't dramatically break up with SpongeBob. They just drifted apart. The show changed, imperceptibly at first, and then obviously, and the people who loved it noticed the change and eventually stopped watching, and the show kept going without them. I think about the kids who grew up on seasons 6 and 7 and only know that version of SpongeBob, and I feel something complicated about that. On one hand, they have a SpongeBob. They have characters they know, and episodes they love, and jokes they repeat with their friends. Who am I to tell them their SpongeBob is lesser? On the other hand, I want them to see what the show was at its best. Not because their version is worthless, but because the Golden Age version is so much richer, so much deeper, so much more alive, that discovering it after growing up on the later seasons is like hearing an acoustic version of a song you only knew as a ringtone. Same melody, completely different experience. And you know what? There's a Plankton element to all of this that I haven't addressed, and I want to take a minute on it because Plankton's trajectory in the show mirrors the overall decline in a way that I find genuinely interesting. In the Golden Age, Sheldon J. Plankton is a villain, sure, but he's a specific kind of villain. He's tiny, he's ambitious, he's obsessed with stealing the Krabby Patty formula, and he's married to a computer named Karen, who is smarter than him and doesn't let him forget it. But here's what makes Plankton work in the early seasons. He's pathetic. Not cruel, not threatening, but pathetic in a way that's genuinely funny, and occasionally even sympathetic. He's been trying to steal the formula for years, and he's never succeeded. He's running a restaurant called the Chum Bucket that has never had a customer. His schemes are elaborate and always fail. There's something almost endearing about his persistence, about the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat is the only possible outcome. He's the villain you root for, just a little, because his ambition is so disproportionate to his abilities that it stops being threatening and starts being relatable. Who hasn't wanted something they couldn't have? Who hasn't spent way too long on a goal that everyone else could see was impossible? In the post-movie era, the show couldn't decide what to do with Plankton. Sometimes he was played as a genuine threat, sometimes as comic relief, sometimes as a sympathetic figure, and the inconsistency drained his character of coherence. But worse than the inconsistency was the cruelty. Remember One Course Meal, the episode I talked about earlier? That's what Plankton became. A character the show was willing to torture. In the Golden Age, his failures were funny because they were self-inflicted. In the post-movie era, his suffering was inflicted by others, specifically by Mr. Krabs, and the show expected us to laugh at it. And I think that shift from self-inflicted comedic failure to externally inflicted cruelty played for laughs is a perfect microcosm of everything that went wrong with the show's humor. And Karen. Oh, Karen Plankton deserves her own video. Honestly, in the Golden Age, Karen is one of the show's most underrated characters. She's Plankton's computer wife, and she delivers some of the driest, most perfectly deadpan lines in the entire series. The dynamic between Plankton's bombastic scheming and Karen's exasperated competence is one of the best comedic relationships in the show, and it only works because both characters are treated as real. Karen isn't just a plot device. She has opinions, she has feelings, she has a marriage that's dysfunctional in ways that are both funny and oddly recognizable. In the post-movie era, Karen's role diminished alongside Plankton's. She became less of a character and more of an appliance, which is exactly the kind of reduction that happens when a show loses track of its own cast. The Golden Age had too many great characters to give equal time to all of them, and that richness was a feature. The post-movie era had the same number of characters, but treated fewer and fewer of them as fully realized people, and that shallowness was a symptom. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe SpongeBob's downfall isn't a tragedy in the classical sense. Maybe it's just the normal life cycle of a creative work in a capitalist system. Born from vision, refined by talent, exploited by commerce, extended beyond its natural lifespan, and ultimately preserved in memory as something better than what it became. If that's the cycle, then SpongeBob followed it perfectly. And the fact that the Golden Age was so good, so uncommonly, undeniably, unreproducibly good, means that even the decline can't diminish it. The good stuff is too good. The good stuff is titanium. Nothing can scratch it. I want to talk about music for a second, because I don't think enough people acknowledge how important the music was to Golden Age SpongeBob, and how much the musical identity shifted in the post-movie era. The early seasons made extensive use of production music, those pre-existing library tracks that you associate with old cartoons and documentaries. But here's what made it work. Hillenburg and the production team had an incredible ear for selecting exactly the right piece of library music for exactly the right moment. The Hawaiian steel guitar tracks, the jazz combos, the jaunty orchestral pieces, the eerie vibraphone cues during horror parody episodes. The music selection in the Golden Age wasn't just background atmosphere. It was an active comedic element. The disconnect between a dramatic orchestral swell and a mundane event like SpongeBob walking to work was itself a joke, one that played continuously throughout every episode and never got old because the musical selection was always specific, always considered, always adding a layer of humor that worked on its own terms. In the post-movie era, the music became less distinctive. The production music was still there, but the selections felt more generic, less carefully matched to the on-screen action, and the show started using more original compositions, which sounds like an upgrade, but often resulted in a more uniform musical texture that lacked the idiosyncratic character of the Golden Age's library music curation. It's a subtle thing. Most viewers probably couldn't articulate what changed about the music, but if you watch a Golden Age episode and a Season 7 episode back-to-back, you can hear the difference. The Golden Age music has personality. The post-movie music has function. And that distinction, personality versus function, applies to almost every aspect of the decline. There's a specific piece of music, Grass Skirt Chase by Sage Guyton and Jeremy Wakefield, That plays during some of the Golden Age's most iconic chase sequences. When you hear it, you're immediately in Bikini Bottom. It triggers a Pavlovian response in anyone who grew up watching the show. That's the power of music in animation. The power to create a sense of place and time and emotion through sound alone. And that power was never fully leveraged again after the Golden Age, because the people selecting the music had different instincts than Hillenburg's team, and those instincts produced different results. Let me bring up one more thing, because there's an aspect of this story that I think deserves attention, and that connects to something broader about how we talk about creative decline, and that's the role of the audience. SpongeBob's audience has changed dramatically over the show's 27-year run. The people who watched season 1 as children are now in their 30s. The people watching the current seasons are a completely different generation, and the show that serves one generation's needs doesn't necessarily serve the others. The Golden Age spoke to a specific cultural moment, late 90s and early 2000s Nickelodeon, a time when the network was willing to take creative risks on strange, idiosyncratic shows that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. The show's audience was broad. Kids watched it for the slapstick. Teenagers watched it for the subversive humor. College students watched it as comfort content and meme material. That breadth of appeal was a consequence of the show's depth, its ability to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The post-movie seasons narrowed that appeal. The humor simplified, the characters flattened, the emotional range contracted. And as a result, the audience skewed younger. The teenagers and college students drifted away. The show became more purely a children's show, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but represents a significant reduction in what SpongeBob used to be. A show that once spoke to everyone narrowed its focus to speak primarily to young children, and in doing so, lost the quality that made it culturally transcendent, rather than merely popular. And the audience that stayed, the devoted fans who stuck around through the dark years and advocated for the show's return to quality, those fans have become the most passionate and most critical community in all of animation fandom. The SpongeBob fan community online is enormous, vocal, and deeply divided on virtually every aspect of the show's later run. Episode rankings generate arguments that go on for pages. The boundary between Golden Age and decline is debated endlessly, with some fans placing it at Season 4, some at Season 5, some at specific episodes within those seasons. Tier lists proliferate. Retrospectives get millions of views. And through all of it, there's this shared understanding, this unspoken consensus that binds the community together. Something special was lost. The details of what was lost, and when it was lost, and who's to blame are endlessly debatable. But the loss itself is not in question. And there's something else I want to talk about before we start wrapping up, because it connects to the emotional core of everything I've been saying. I want to talk about comfort viewing, about what it means to fall asleep to something. Because that's what this channel is about, right? That's why you're here, probably. To fall asleep to the sound of someone talking about a cartoon. And I think the relationship between SpongeBob and sleep, between SpongeBob and comfort, between SpongeBob and the feeling of safety you get from rewatching something familiar in the dark, is one of the most interesting aspects of the show's cultural legacy. Here's my theory, and I don't think I've heard anyone else put it this way. SpongeBob became comfort content, not because it's relaxing, but because it's reliable. The Golden Age episodes create a closed, self-contained world where the rules are known and the outcomes are safe. SpongeBob will always be optimistic. Squidward will always be grumpy. Patrick will always be there. The Krusty Krab will always open in the morning. Nothing permanently bad will happen to anyone you care about. And in a world, the real world, where nothing feels certain and everything feels precarious, and the news is a relentless stream of anxiety, that reliability is profoundly soothing. You can fall asleep to Golden Age SpongeBob because you trust it. You trust that it won't suddenly become something frightening or sad or disturbing. You trust that the world you're falling asleep inside of will still be there when you wake up. That's a remarkable thing for a cartoon to provide. And it's something the post-movie era partially undermined by introducing mean-spirited humor and character violations that broke the trust. You can't fully relax watching an episode if you're worried the show might suddenly have Mr. Krabs drive Plankton to suicidal ideation. The safety is gone. The reliability is compromised. And comfort content that isn't reliable isn't comfort content anymore. I've thought about this in the context of the show's decline, and I think it adds another dimension to the loss. It's not just that the show got less funny or less well-crafted. It's that the show got less safe. And for millions of people who use SpongeBob as a source of emotional regulation, as background noise for anxiety, as a nightlight against the dark, that loss of safety is personal in a way that a decline in comedic quality isn't. It's not just disappointing. It's destabilizing. It takes away something you were relying on to feel okay. And that, I think, is why the anger about the decline runs so deep. It's not aesthetic snobbery. It's not nostalgia for childhood. It's grief for a specific feeling that the show used to provide and then stopped providing. A feeling of warmth, a feeling of safety, a feeling that somewhere, under the ocean, there's a sponge in a pineapple who will never, ever let you down. I've been thinking about something Tom Kenny said in an interview once. He said he could divide his entire lifespan into pre-SpongeBob and post-SpongeBob. That so much of his time and energy has been spent on the show, and that he's never resented it, never regretted it, that it's always felt like the right thing to do. And there's something beautiful and something sad about that, because Tom Kenny has given SpongeBob everything. He has shown up to every recording session for over a quarter century and delivered a performance that is consistently one of the best things about every episode, even the bad ones. The voice actors are the last thread connecting the current show to the golden age, and as long as Tom Kenny is SpongeBob, there's a piece of the original intention in every episode. But voice acting can only do so much. A brilliant vocal performance in service of weak material is still weak material with a brilliant vocal performance on top of it. And I think the voice actors know this. I think they've always known this. And I think there's something poignant about watching these incredibly talented people continue to bring their absolute best to a show that, for long stretches, was no longer bringing its best to them. Okay, I think I'm nearing the end of what I want to say about all of this, and I want to bring the two threads together one final time. Thread 1. The creative soul. SpongeBob SquarePants was created by a marine biologist who became an animator, who studied under experimental filmmakers, who found his voice on Rocko's Modern Life, and who spent the late 1990s building a world that reflected his love of the ocean, his gift for absurdist comedy, and his belief that a children's show could be as sophisticated, as emotionally rich, and as artistically ambitious as any other form of entertainment. For 3 seasons and a movie, he succeeded. He made something that was perfect. Not perfect in the sense that every episode is a masterpiece, but perfect in the sense that it was exactly what he intended it to be. A warm, funny, strange, beautiful show about a sea sponge who chooses to be happy. Thread 2. The Machine. Nickelodeon, faced with the reality that their most valuable property had a creator who wanted to end it, chose continuation over conclusion. They removed the organizing creative intelligence from the show, accelerated the production schedule, expanded the franchise across multiple platforms and demographics, and transformed SpongeBob from a work of art into a commercial ecosystem. The show continued. The quality declined. The characters flanderized. The humor coarsened. The emotional depth evaporated. And the show's cultural legacy, which should have been an unimpeachable monument to creative excellence, became something more complicated. A monument with an asterisk. Amazing, but only for the first 3 seasons. The rest is complicated. Those two threads ran parallel for a while, then they diverged. And the story of SpongeBob's downfall is the story of that divergence. The story of what happens when a corporation takes custody of an artist's vision and decides that the vision is less important than the revenue it generates. And now I want to end with a question. Not a rhetorical question. Not a question with a pre-prepared answer. But a real question that I've been turning over in my head for weeks, and that I still don't have a clean answer to. Was it worth it? Not the Golden Age. The Golden Age was unambiguously worth it. The Golden Age is a treasure. I mean everything that came after. Was it worth it to have those additional seasons, even the bad ones? Was it worth it to have the movies, even the diminished ones? Was it worth it to have the spin-offs, even the controversial ones? Was it worth having SpongeBob persist as a living, continuing, evolving cultural presence for 27 years and counting, even if the cost of that persistence was the dilution of the very thing that made him special? I keep going back and forth on this. Part of me wants to say no. Part of me wants to say that ending the show after the movie would have been better for SpongeBob's legacy, better for Hillenburg's peace of mind, better for the art form, that a perfect 3 seasons and a movie is worth more than 27 years of diminishing returns. But another part of me thinks about the kids who discovered SpongeBob through season 5, or season 8, or season 12, and worked their way backward to the golden age and had their minds blown. I think about the memes that kept SpongeBob culturally alive during the years when the show itself was at its weakest. I think about the fan communities that formed around the decline, communities that produced some of the most thoughtful, passionate, and analytically rigorous criticism of animated television I've ever encountered. I think about the fact that SpongeBob's continued existence, even in diminished form, meant that when Hillenburg died, there was still a living show to mourn through, still new episodes to carry his name into the future, still a world that existed because he existed. And I honestly don't know which side of that equation wins. I don't know if continuity outweighs dilution. I don't know if cultural presence outweighs artistic integrity. I don't know if keeping SpongeBob alive was worth the cost of what he became. And maybe not knowing is okay. Maybe the appropriate response to something this complicated isn't certainty, but ambivalence. Maybe SpongeBob's downfall, like SpongeBob himself, resists simple categorization. Maybe it's simultaneously a tragedy and a testament, a cautionary tale about corporate greed, and a love story about a show that meant too much to too many people for anyone to let it go. What I do know is this. There is a cartoon about a sea sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea. For 3 seasons, that cartoon was as close to perfect as animated television has ever come. And the man who made it perfect loved the ocean so much that he spent his entire career, from marine biology to animation to showrunning to his final years, fighting a terminal illness, trying to share that love with the world in the most joyful way he could imagine. And whatever happened to the show after he left, whatever Nickelodeon did with it, whatever the spin-offs became, whatever the franchise turned into, none of it can touch those first 3 seasons. None of it can diminish what Steven Hillenburg built. He gave us something that doesn't go away. Something that's still there, waiting. Every time you press play on Season 1, Episode 1, and hear that theme song, and feel that warmth, and know that for the next 11 minutes, you're in the hands of someone who cared about every single frame. So if you're watching this late at night, and you can't sleep, and the world feels like too much, go watch Pizza Delivery. Go watch Band Geeks. Go watch Chocolate with Nuts. Go back to Bikini Bottom. Not the version of Bikini Bottom that exists in the latest season. The original one. The one that Steven Hillenburg built. It's still there. It will always be there. And if you still can't sleep after that, well, that's what the next video is for. Thank you for being here tonight. I mean that. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. It really does help us keep making these for you. And I genuinely love making them. Good night.